Don't raise your voice at my mom again!
The dining room had gone completely silent, and every waiter in the restaurant was holding their breath. A small girl, no older than 6, stood between a trembling waitress and the most feared man in the city. She did not blink. She did not step back. She lifted her chin, planted her feet, and said the words that no one in that room ever expected to hear directed at Jae-hyuk Sim. Don't raise your voice at my mom again. For a long moment, nobody moved. The clinking of glasses stopped. A waiter froze mid-step with a tray balanced on his palm. Even the soft jazz piano playing from the speakers in the corner seemed to fade into the background, as if the room itself understood that something important was happening. Jae-hyuk Sim looked down at the child in front of him. He was a man used to grown adults flinching at the sound of his footsteps. Business partners rearranged their schedules around his convenience. Rivals whispered his name like a curse. And yet here was a little girl, barely reaching his waist, staring him down without a trace of fear. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sasha Beaumont's heart pounded so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She reached for her daughter's shoulder, her voice a fragile whisper. Angela, sweetheart, please. It's okay, Mom, Angela said without turning around. He shouldn't have yelled at you. Sasha's hands were shaking. She had been on her feet since noon, carrying trays through a lunch rush and now an evening reservation for one of the most powerful men in Seoul's underground economy. An order mix-up, a miscommunication with the kitchen, and suddenly Jae-hyuk's voice had risen sharply enough to turn heads across the room. It wasn't rage. It wasn't violence. But it was enough to make the staff go rigid with dread, because everyone in that restaurant knew exactly who he was. Jae-hyuk's jaw tightened. He could have said something cutting. He could have made an example of the moment, the way men in his position often did, if only to protect their reputation. Instead, he crouched down, bringing himself to Angela's eye level. You're not afraid of me, he said. It wasn't a question. Should I be? Angela asked. He almost smiled. Almost. No, he said quietly. You shouldn't be. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and without another word to the frightened staff, he turned and walked toward the private dining room where his associates were waiting. But something had shifted in him. He barely spoke through the rest of the meeting. His mind kept drifting back to a pair of dark, unshaken eyes and a voice that hadn't wavered. That night, as his driver took him home through the quiet streets, Jae-hyuk stared out the window without really seeing the city lights pass by. He had built an empire on being unshakable, on making people small with a single look. And a 6-year-old girl had looked right through all of it. He told himself it meant nothing. A child's outburst, nothing more. But the memory refused to leave him. 2 days later, obligation brought him somewhere he rarely bothered to go himself. His niece's elementary school. His sister was overseas for work, and Yuna, an 8-year-old with a quiet, guarded nature, had been staying with him. He normally sent a driver to pick her up. That afternoon, for reasons he didn't examine too closely, he went himself. He arrived early and stood near the school gate, arms crossed, watching children spill out in loud, colorful groups. And there she was, Angela, backpack nearly as big as she was, walking with the same fearless posture she'd worn in the restaurant. He watched as a cluster of older kids surrounded Yuna near the fence. His niece shrank into herself, the way she always did when she felt cornered, clutching her bag to her chest as the other children laughed at something. Her stutter, maybe, or the way she always ate lunch alone. Jae-hyuk took a step forward, ready to intervene, when Angela beat him to it. She walked straight into the middle of the group, planted herself beside Yuna, and said something too quiet for him to hear from where he stood. Whatever it was, it worked. The older kids exchanged uncertain glances and backed off, muttering among themselves before scattering toward the buses. Yuna looked up at Angela, stunned. And then, for the first time in longer than Jae-hyuk could remember, his niece smiled. He stood frozen by the gate, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. He had spent years building walls so high that nothing could touch him. And this child, who didn't know a single thing about who he was or what he'd done to protect his family's business, kept finding cracks in those walls without even trying. That evening, over a dinner neither of them finished, Yuna finally spoke. "Angela's my only real friend," she said, staring at her plate. "Nobody else talks to me unless it's to make fun of me." Jae-hyuk set down his chopsticks. "She defended you today." Yuna nodded. "She always does that. She's not scared of anyone." He thought about the restaurant, about the way Angela had looked at him without flinching. "No," he murmured. "She isn't." For the first time in years, Jae-hyuk found himself curious about someone who had nothing to do with contracts, territory, or leverage. He didn't know what to do with that curiosity, so for a while, he simply let it sit there, unexamined, like a splinter he hadn't decided whether to remove. He thought about his own childhood on the drive home, something he rarely allowed himself to do. He remembered being small once, watching his father command a room with nothing more than a look, learning early that softness was a weakness to be trained out of a person. No one had ever stood between him and his father's temper. No one had ever dared. He wondered, not for the first time, what kind of man he might have become if someone had. At home, Yuna was already at the table, picking at her rice without much interest. "You've been quiet since we got back," Jae-hyuk said, sitting across from her. "I keep thinking about how she just walked right up to them," Yuna said. "Like she wasn't scared at all. I wish I could be like that." "You don't have to be exactly like her," he said. "You only have to stop believing you're smaller than you are." Yuna considered that for a moment, then gave a small, uncertain nod, the kind of nod that suggested the words hadn't quite landed yet but might, eventually, take root. It didn't take long for his curiosity to demand more of his attention. A week later, Yuna came home from school unusually quiet. She picked at her dinner, refusing to meet his eyes, until he finally asked what was wrong. "Angela wasn't at school today," she said. "She wasn't there yesterday either." Jae-hyuk felt something twist in his stomach, sharp and immediate. Though he couldn't explain why a missing classmate should concern a man who oversaw a criminal network with the coldness of a spreadsheet. He told himself it was simply loose ends bothering him, the way an unresolved detail always did. The next afternoon, he had his driver take him to the restaurant instead of his usual meetings. The manager, visibly nervous at the unannounced visit, informed him that Sasha hadn't shown up for her shifts in 3 days and wasn't answering calls. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow, and it only takes a second. Something about the silence on the other end of that unanswered phone unsettled him more than any threat from a rival organization ever had. He gave quiet instructions to 2 of his most trusted men. Not to intimidate, not to pressure, only to find out if Sasha and her daughter were safe. What they found made his stomach drop. Sasha and Angela had been evicted from their small apartment. The landlord, a distant cousin of Sasha's late husband's family, had stopped renewing the lease after her father-in-law quietly withdrew the financial support he'd been providing for years. Struggling under his own debts, the old man had simply told her to figure life out on her own, and disappeared, leaving Sasha with 2 suitcases, a crying 6-year-old, and nowhere to go. They were staying in a cramped motel on the edge of the city, the kind of place with flickering hallway lights and thin walls that did nothing to block out the noise from the street below. Jae-hyuk went there himself. Sasha opened the door just enough to see who it was, and her expression hardened instantly. Exhaustion had carved shadows under her eyes, but her voice was steady. "What are you doing here?" "I heard what happened," he said. "I want to help. We don't need charity." The door started to close. "This isn't charity," he said quickly. "And it isn't for you." That made her pause. "Angela protected my niece," he continued. "When no other adult stepped in fast enough, she stood up for a girl she barely knew, without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. I want to make sure she's safe. That's all this is." Sasha studied him for a long moment, arms crossed protectively over her chest. Behind her, Angela peeked out from behind the motel bed, eyes wide with recognition. "I don't take favors from powerful men," Sasha said quietly. Favors always come with strings. Then don't think of it as a favor, Jae-hyuk said. Think of it as a debt. Your daughter did something for my family. Let me do something for yours. It took another full day of quiet, careful persuasion, and Angela tugging gently on her mother's sleeve, whispering that the new place had a real bed and maybe even a yard, before Sasha finally agreed. Not for herself. Never for herself. But because the temporary housing meant her daughter would sleep somewhere warm and safe, with locks that worked and walls that didn't shake every time a truck passed outside. She told herself it would only be until she found her footing again. That first night in the new house, after Angela had finally drifted off to sleep, Sasha sat alone in the unfamiliar kitchen, turning the situation over in her mind. She had spent 6 years refusing to lean on anyone, terrified that dependence would leave her vulnerable the way Daniel's death had. Every bill she'd paid alone, every late shift she'd taken so Angela could have new shoes for school, had been a small act of proof. Proof that she didn't need saving, that she could hold her family together with nothing but stubbornness and exhaustion. Accepting help from a man like Jae-hyuk Sim felt, in some quiet corner of her mind, like admitting defeat. And yet Angela had slept soundly for the first time in weeks, no longer waking at every creak of the motel's thin walls, no longer asking in a small voice whether they'd have to move again. That alone, Sasha decided, made it worth the discomfort. She would keep her guard up. She would remind herself, as often as necessary, that gratitude was not the same as trust. She didn't expect it to become something more. Weeks passed, and Jae-hyuk found himself slipping quietly into their lives in ways he hadn't planned. On mornings when Sasha had early shifts at a new restaurant he'd helped her find, he arranged for Angela to be driven to school, and more often than he intended, he went himself, watching her chatter about her day from the rearview mirror. He spent afternoons with Yuna, encouraging her to speak up more, to laugh louder, to stop apologizing for taking up space. Slowly, the two girls became inseparable, trading stickers and secrets, and the particular loyalty that only children seem capable of building overnight. Angela stopped flinching when Jae-hyuk entered a room. She started saving him a seat at the small kitchen table in the house he'd arranged for them, chattering about her day as if he were simply another adult who belonged there. Sasha noticed all of it, and she hated how much it moved her. She had built her own walls after Daniel died, walls made of double shifts and forced independence, walls meant to keep her from ever depending on anyone again, especially not a man whose reputation preceded him into every room. But those walls cracked a little more every time she watched him kneel down to help Angela with her shoelaces, or heard him patiently correct Yuna's homework without a hint of impatience in his voice. Behind the fear his name inspired in others, Sasha began to see something else. A tired, guarded man carrying weight he never spoke about. A man who flinched almost imperceptibly whenever someone mentioned family. One Saturday afternoon, Jae-hyuk took the girls to a small carnival near the harbor, insisting Sasha come along, to make sure Angela doesn't talk him into buying every stuffed animal in sight. Sasha nearly refused out of habit before catching herself, surprised by how easily she'd almost agreed without thinking twice. They spent the afternoon wandering between game booths, Angela and Yuna trading turns tossing rings at bottles neither of them ever managed to knock down, laughing so hard they could barely stand upright. Jae-hyuk won a small stuffed fox at a shooting game and presented it to Yuna with mock formality, bowing like a knight offering a prize. Sasha heard him laugh for the first time that day, really laugh unguarded, and the sound caught her off guard, because she realized she'd never heard it before. Watching him crouch down to retie Angela's shoe when it came undone near the Ferris wheel, patient despite the line of people waiting behind them, Sasha felt something loosen in her chest that she wasn't ready to name. "You're staring," he said later, catching her eye over the girls' heads as they waited in line for cotton candy. "I'm just trying to figure you out," she admitted. "Any luck?" "Not yet," she said. "You're more complicated than your reputation suggests." "Most people are," he said quietly. "Reputations are easier to build than they are to correct." She thought about that long after they'd driven home that evening, the girls asleep in the back seat, sticky-fingered and worn out from a day that had felt, for a few stolen hours, almost normal, almost like the life she'd once imagined for her family before everything had been taken from her. One evening, After the girls had fallen asleep in the next room, Sasha sat across from him at the kitchen table, 2 untouched cups of tea between them. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He nodded. "Why does any of this matter to you? Really?" Her eyes searched his face. "You could have sent money. You could have had someone else handle it. Why do you keep coming back?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly in his hands. "Because for the first time in a long time, being around your daughter, around your family, doesn't feel like a transaction," he said finally. "Everyone in my world wants something from me. Angela never has." Sasha looked down at her tea. "My husband died wanting nothing more than to come home to us every night," she said softly. "A hit-and-run driver took that from him. From us. 6 years ago, almost to the week." Something shifted in Jae-hyuk's expression. So subtle she almost missed it. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice had gone strangely tight. "The police never found the driver," Sasha continued, staring at nothing. "The case just went cold, like it didn't matter enough to solve." Later that night, alone in his study, Jae-hyuk poured himself a drink he didn't touch. He thought about the family business he'd inherited without ever truly choosing it. The quiet agreements his father had made over the decades, deals sealed with handshakes and silence rather than paperwork. He had always told himself he only handled what was necessary: territory, protection, the machinery of an empire built long before he was born. He had never asked too many questions about the parts of the ledger that didn't concern him directly. Now he wondered how much of that comfortable ignorance had been a choice all along. Jae-hyuk said nothing more that night, but the date she mentioned kept circling in his mind, refusing to let him rest. Something about it felt wrong, familiar in a way he couldn't yet place, like a name on the tip of his tongue. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, he made a call to one of his most discreet contacts and asked them to pull old records. Not because he suspected anything specific, only because the unease in his chest wouldn't quiet until he understood why. If you want to see how this story unfolds, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next chapter. And if a part of this story has moved you already, tell us in the comments. We read every single one. Took 3 days for the file to reach him. 3 days of watching Sasha laugh a little more freely, of watching Angela climb into his lap during movie nights without a second thought, of feeling, for the first time in years, something close to belonging. Then he opened the file, and everything he'd built in those weeks threatened to collapse. The accident report was old, deliberately buried, cross-referenced with a name that made his hands go cold. The vehicle involved in the hit-and-run that killed Daniel Beaumont had been registered to his family. The driver listed in a secondary, less official document, the kind that only existed because someone in his father's old network had been too careless to destroy every copy, was his own younger brother, Min-suk. Jae-hyuk sat alone in his office long after his men had gone home, staring at the pages until the words blurred. His father had died 3 years earlier, taking whatever justification he might have offered to his grave. But the evidence was unmistakable. Min-suk had been driving that night. Their father had used every resource at his disposal to make the investigation disappear, to keep his younger, less disciplined son out of prison and the family name out of scandal. He thought of Min-suk as a boy, trailing after him through their father's estate, always eager to be included, always a little too reckless for their father's liking. He remembered the year Min-suk had gotten his license, how their father had bought him an expensive car as a reward, how proud his brother had been driving it around the city that summer. Jae-hyuk had been away on business for most of that year, building the connections that would later cement his place at the head of the family's operations. He hadn't been paying attention to his younger brother's comings and goings. He hadn't been paying attention to much of anything outside the ledger. Jae-hyuk had never known. He told himself that over and over, pacing the length of his office as the city lights blinked outside his window. He had never known someone had died. He had never known that the woman he was slowly falling for, the woman whose daughter had cracked open something in him, he thought long buried, had lost her husband because of his own blood. He didn't sleep that night. The next blow came before he even had the chance to decide how to tell her. Sasha's father-in-law appeared at her door 2 days later, gaunt and trembling, guilt etched into every line of his face. He hadn't spoken to her in months. Not since he'd forced her and Angela out onto the street. But something had clearly been eating at him, and he could no longer carry it alone. "I need to tell you something," he said, refusing to meet her eyes. "About Daniel." Sasha's stomach dropped. "What about him?" "6 years ago," the old man said, his voice cracking, "a man came to me, offered me more money than I'd ever seen in my life. Told me the case would never be solved either way, that pushing harder would only bring danger to you and Angela. He told me to convince you there was no hope of justice, so you'd stop asking questions." Sasha's hands began to shake. "Who was he?" The old man swallowed hard. "Sim, the father of the man you've been letting into your home." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Every kindness Jae-hyuk had shown her over the past weeks flashed through her mind, and each memory now felt tainted, poisoned by a truth she hadn't been ready to hear. "You knew," she whispered. "All this time you knew, and you let me struggle. You let me think there was no one to blame." "I was scared," the old man said, tears finally spilling over. "I'm sorry. I should have told you years ago." Sasha barely heard the rest of his apology. Her mind had already jumped ahead, spinning through a single devastating thought. If his father had orchestrated the cover-up, how much did Jae-hyuk actually know? Had his kindness been real, or had it been guilt, dressed up as affection, offered only because his family owed her one? When Jae-hyuk arrived that evening, still gathering the courage to tell her the truth himself, he found her standing in the doorway with Angela's small hand held tightly in hers, 2 suitcases packed by the stairs. "You knew," she said before he could speak. Her voice was flat, hollowed out by betrayal. "Sasha, I only found out 3 days ago," he said, stepping forward. "I swear to you, your family," she cut in, her voice breaking. "Your father paid my father-in-law to bury the investigation into my husband's death, and your brother was driving the car." Jae-hyuk went pale. "I didn't know that part until the file came back. I was going to tell you tonight." "How am I supposed to believe that?" Tears streamed freely down her face now. "How am I supposed to believe anything you've told me, when your family took away the only chance I had at justice?" "I understand you're angry," he said carefully, "and you have every right to be, but I am not my father, and I am not my brother. I would never." "I can't do this," Sasha said, cutting him off, her voice trembling with exhaustion and grief. "I can't keep pretending this doesn't change everything. I need to leave." Angela looked between them, confusion and fear pooling in her small face. "Mom? Are we leaving Uncle Jae-hyuk's house?" Sasha crouched down, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead, forcing her voice to stay gentle even as it shook. "We're going to be okay, baby. I promise." Jae-hyuk didn't stop them. He stood in the doorway and watched them walk down the front steps, Angela glancing back once, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, before Sasha guided her into the waiting taxi. Something inside him hardened into resolve as the taillights disappeared down the street. He wouldn't chase her. He wouldn't beg for a forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved yet. Instead, he would do the one thing that might actually mean something: the truth. The following morning, Jae-hyuk walked into a police station he had spent years avoiding and handed over every document his contact had recovered. The accident report, the falsified statements, the record of the payment made to Sasha's father-in-law. He gave a full statement implicating his own brother, his own late father's network, without asking for a single favor in return. He visited Min-suk once before the arrest, in a quiet room away from the rest of the family's business. His younger brother sat hunched over, refusing to meet his eyes. "I was 18, Min-suk said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I panicked. Father told me it would be handled, that I should never speak of it again, and I was too much of a coward to argue." "A man died," Jae-hyuk said quietly. "A family lost everything." "I know." Min-suk's shoulders shook. "I've known for 6 years. I just didn't know how to undo it." "You don't get to undo it," Jae-hyuk said. "But you can stop hiding from it." His legal advisors warned him it would cost him everything. Rival organizations were already circling, Sensing weakness the moment word got out that Jae-hyuk Sim had turned over evidence against his own blood. His grip on the business his father built had depended, in part, on the fear that no one, not even family, was safe from consequences if they crossed him. Now that same principle was about to be turned against his own house. He didn't care. Min-suk was arrested within the week. The evidence too damning to ignore. 6 years of buried guilt finally catching up to him in a single afternoon. Sasha's father-in-law was arrested shortly after, charged with obstruction and accepting money to bury a criminal investigation. In a rare public statement, Jae-hyuk stood before cameras he usually avoided at all costs and accepted responsibility for what his family had done, even the parts he had never known about, even the silence he hadn't chosen but had still, in some way, inherited. "I cannot undo what happened," he said, his voice steady despite the storm gathering behind his eyes. "But I will not hide from it, and I will not let another family suffer in silence the way this one did." The fallout was immediate. Longtime partners severed ties. Whispers of a coming power struggle spread through the underground like wildfire. His empire, built on decades of careful intimidation, began to crumble at the edges, piece by piece, as he chose accountability over control for the first time in his life. He told himself it was worth it, even on the nights the loneliness felt unbearable, when the house felt too large and too quiet, and Yuna's questions about when Angela might visit again went unanswered because he had no honest response to give her. Real quick, if this story has kept you hooked, smash that like button and drop a comment letting us know what you think is going to happen next. It genuinely helps more people discover this channel. Months passed in a blur of legal proceedings, quiet restructuring, and long, sleepless nights. Sasha and Angela moved into a modest apartment across the city, one Sasha found and paid for entirely on her own, refusing every attempt Jae-hyuk made to help, even anonymously. Daniel's name was finally cleared in the official record. The truth of what happened to him laid bare after 6 long years of unanswered questions. Sasha sat in the courtroom the day the ruling was read, gripping Angela's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white, tears streaming down her face. Not from grief this time, but from something closer to relief. It didn't erase what she'd lost. Nothing ever would. But at least now the world knew the truth. At least now her daughter would grow up understanding exactly what kind of man her father had been, and exactly what had been taken from them both. Angela still asked about Jae-hyuk sometimes, in the quiet, unguarded way children do. "Is Uncle Jae-hyuk okay?" she'd ask, tracing patterns on the kitchen table. "Yuna misses me. I miss her too." Sasha never quite knew how to answer. The anger that had once consumed her had softened over the months into something more complicated. Something she didn't yet have a name for. She had watched, from a distance, as Jae-hyuk dismantled pieces of the very empire that had once made him untouchable, simply because it was the right thing to do. She had heard, through mutual acquaintances, how he'd personally ensured Min-suk faced the full consequences of his actions, refusing to use his remaining influence to soften the sentence. It didn't undo the pain, but it meant something. One evening, Angela climbed onto the couch beside her mother, tucking her small feet beneath her. "Mom, are you still mad at Uncle Jae-hyuk?" Sasha set down the book she wasn't really reading. "It's complicated, baby. Yuna says he cries sometimes when he thinks nobody's watching," Angela said, matter of fact in the way only children could manage. "She says he's sad because you're not there anymore." Sasha felt her chest tighten. "Grown-up things are hard to explain sometimes. You always tell me the truth is better than pretending," Angela pressed, undeterred. "Even when it hurts." Sasha pulled her daughter close, resting her chin on top of her head. "You're right. The truth is I don't know how I feel yet, and that's okay. Sometimes it takes grown-ups longer to sort out their hearts than it takes kids." Angela seemed to accept that, settling against her mother's side, and for a while neither of them said anything else. The television played quietly in the background, forgotten, while Sasha turned Angela's words over in her mind long after her daughter had drifted off to sleep against her shoulder. One afternoon, nearly 5 months after she'd walked out of his house, Sasha received a message asking if they could meet. Just once, no expectations attached. She almost said no. She stared at her phone for a long time, thumb hovering over the screen, old wounds and new understanding warring inside her. Eventually, she agreed. They met in a quiet park on the edge of the city, far from the restaurants and boardrooms that had once defined their strange, complicated connection. Jae-hyuk looked different somehow. Thinner, more tired, but also lighter in a way she couldn't quite explain, as though setting down the weight of his father's secrets had cost him everything and freed him all at once. "Thank you for coming," he said. Sasha sat down on the bench beside him, keeping a careful distance. "What did you want to say?" "I wanted to apologize," he said. "Not because I expect you to forgive me. I know some things can't simply be forgiven. But you deserve to hear it directly, not through lawyers or headlines." He took a breath. "I'm sorry for what my family did to you and Daniel. I'm sorry it took 6 years. And I'm sorry that even now, no apology can give you back what you lost. I should have looked harder, asked more questions, paid closer attention to what my father was capable of. I didn't, and people I care about paid the price for that blindness." Sasha was quiet for a long moment, watching a pair of birds dart between the branches above them. "I forgive you," she said finally. Something in his expression shifted, hope flickering cautiously behind his eyes. "But forgiveness and love aren't the same thing," she continued, her voice gentle but firm. "I don't hate you anymore, Jae-hyuk. I understand that you didn't know, and that when you found out, you did the hardest thing a person in your position could have done. I respect that. I respect you." She paused, searching for the right words. "But I don't know if I can ever love you the way things were heading before. Too much happened. Too much was taken. I need time. Maybe more time than either of us can promise right now." "I know," Jae-hyuk said. "I didn't come here expecting anything different." "What will you do now?" Sasha asked. "With everything falling apart around you?" He considered the question for a moment, watching the girls chase each other across the grass in the distance. "Rebuild, maybe. Something smaller. Something I don't have to be ashamed of if my niece ever asks what I do for a living." He gave a small, tired smile. "It's strange. I spent years thinking power was the only thing that kept people safe. Angela taught me that courage matters more. She has a way of doing that," Sasha said, a faint smile tugging at her own mouth despite everything. "Daniel used to say the same thing about her, even before she could talk. Said she came into the world unafraid of it. He sounds like he raised a remarkable daughter." "We raised her together, for a little while," Sasha said softly. "I try to remember that, even on the hard days, that some of the best of her came from him." Jae-hyuk nodded, letting the silence settle comfortably between them for once, instead of the tension that had defined so many of their conversations these past months. "Thank you," Sasha said eventually, "for telling the truth, even when it cost you everything. Not many people in your position would have." "It didn't feel like a choice," he admitted. "Not once I understood what silence had already cost your family." Jae-hyuk nodded slowly, absorbing the words without argument. "I understand," he said. "I'm not asking for more than that." They sat together in silence for a while, not as strangers, not as the people they'd been before the truth tore everything apart, but as two people slowly learning what honesty without expectation could look like. Across the park, Angela and Yuna ran through the grass, laughing, utterly unaware of the complicated history tangled between the adults who loved them. Their friendship had never wavered, untouched by betrayal, cover-ups, or grief. The simple, stubborn loyalty of two children who had chosen each other long before any of the adults understood what that choice would come to mean. Sasha watched them with a small, peaceful smile, some of the tension finally easing from her shoulders. Jae-hyuk watched too, from a respectful distance, his hands in his pockets, no longer the untouchable figure who had once silenced an entire restaurant with a single sentence. Just a man, quietly hoping that someday, broken trust might find its way back to something whole. Their eyes met across the park one last time before Sasha rose to call the girls over for the walk home. There was no anger left in that look, no accusation, only the quiet, fragile possibility that maybe, given enough time, two people who had survived the worst of each other's families might someday find their way to something real. Justice may restore the truth. Forgiveness may restore peace. But love, real love, must always be freely chosen. Never rushed, never owed, never forced by guilt or circumstance. If the story touched you, let us know in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories like this one, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how long it takes. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.